My daughter was sitting on the ground outside, a locked clinic, whispering to a man who died a year ago. I still can't get that image out of my head. No matter how many months have passed, no matter how many times I've tried to move on, that picture stays with me like a scar that never fully heals. Lily was 9 years old. She was barefoot. Her little arms were wrapped around herself, and her whole body was shaking from the cold. She wasn't crying out loud. She was just whispering. Over and over again, in this small, broken voice, she kept saying the same thing. With all the steadiness she could hold on to, she looked up and whispered, "Dad said he'd come back here. I just need to wait a little longer." And right then, my heart didn't just break. It shattered. There were no adults around. Nobody watching her. Nobody keeping her safe. Just my little girl, alone, in the cold, waiting for someone who was never coming back. Something had gone terribly wrong. I didn't know the full story yet. I didn't know how she got there, or why no one stopped her, or how long she'd been sitting on that hard concrete alone. All I knew in that moment was pure, raw panic. At that moment, I didn't know this wasn't an accident. It was something my own mother had done. Hi everyone, my name is Elena. I'm 38, and this story happened 3 days after I made the worst decision of my life. I'm a public defender here in Chicago. That means every single day I walk into a courtroom and fight for people who can't fight for themselves. I believe in justice. I believe in doing the right thing, even when it's hard. But nothing in my career, nothing in all those years of standing up for strangers in court, prepared me for what I had to face inside my own family. 3 years ago, I lost my husband, David. He wasn't just my partner, he was my anchor. He was the kind of dad who remembered every little thing, Lily's favorite color, the exact way she liked her grilled cheese, the bedtime song she needed to hear when the world felt too loud. And for Lily, losing him wasn't just losing a parent. It was losing the one person who truly understood her. See, Lily has a sensory processing condition. Crowds, loud noises, sudden changes, all of it hits her harder than most kids. David had this gift for reading her before she even knew something was wrong. He'd quietly take her hand, lead her somewhere calm, and just sit with her until the world made sense again. After he was gone, I tried my best to fill that space, but I was drowning. The grief, the bills, the late nights at the office, the endless casework. I was barely keeping my head above water. So when my mother, Margaret, offered to help with Lily, I said yes. I said yes because I was exhausted. I said yes because she was family. And I said yes because some part of me still believed that family meant safe. Looking back now, I should have said no the moment she offered to help. It started with a dinner that should have been normal, but never was. It was a Thursday evening, 3 days before everything fell apart. My mom had suggested we go out to this Italian place she liked on the north side of Chicago. Nothing fancy, but it was always packed on weeknights. Loud music, lots of people talking over each other, dishes clanging in the kitchen. The kind of place I personally loved. But the moment we walked through that door, I felt Lily tighten her grip on my hand. Right away, I leaned down toward her and said quietly, "Hey, you okay? We can grab a table in the corner if you want." She nodded, but I could already see it in her eyes. That look. The one that told me she was already working overtime just to hold herself together. We found a corner booth and settled in. For a little while, things were okay. Lily colored on the paper menu they gave her, and I let myself breathe for a second. But then the table next to us exploded into laughter. A big group birthday celebration, loud and sudden. And just like that, Lily flinched hard. Her coloring book slid off the table, her water glass tipped, and before I could catch it, the glass hit the floor with a sharp crack that turned heads from 3 tables away. Immediately, Lily pressed her hands over her ears and started rocking slightly in her seat. I reached for her and said calmly, "It's okay, baby. It was just an accident. I've got you." But before I could do anything else, I heard my mother's voice cut through the noise. Margaret sat up straighter in her seat, looked across the table at Lily with that tight expression I'd known my whole life, and said loud enough for the people nearby to hear, "Elena, this is embarrassing. She needs to learn to control herself in public." The words hit me like a slap. For a second, I couldn't even respond. I just stared at her. Then, keeping my voice as steady as I could, I looked directly at my mother and said, "She has a condition, Mom. This isn't a behavior problem. She's not doing this on purpose." Margaret pressed her lips together and glanced around at the other diners, clearly more concerned about what strangers thought than what her granddaughter was feeling. Without missing a beat, she leaned forward and said flatly, "When you were her age, I didn't allow that kind of thing. A little structure goes a long way. That's all I'm saying." Right then, a slow burn started rising in my chest. I took a breath, wrapped my arm around Lily's shoulders, and said to my mother in a low, firm voice, "Don't do this right now. Not here. Not in front of her." Lily was still covering her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. She hadn't heard the exchange, but I had, and I felt every single word of it. A server came over quickly and helped us clean up. I asked for our food to go, and the three of us sat in that thick, awful silence while we waited. Margaret didn't apologize. She didn't soften. She just folded her hands on the table and looked out the window like none of it had happened. On the drive home, I tried to shake it off. I told myself she was from a different generation. I told myself she meant well, even if her delivery was terrible. I told myself that one rough dinner didn't mean anything. But deep down, something uncomfortable was sitting heavy in my gut, because I'd seen that look on her face before. That look that said she wasn't just annoyed. She was convinced she was right. That night, she didn't argue anymore, and that silence should have scared me. According to my mother, it was only supposed to be 10 minutes. That's what she told me later, 10 minutes. Like that number was supposed to make it okay. Like slapping a time limit on something cruel somehow made it reasonable. But let me tell you what actually happened that morning, because I pieced it together bit by bit, and every single detail made me feel sicker than the one before it. It was a Friday. I had an early hearing downtown that I couldn't reschedule. I'd asked Margaret to stay with Lily until I got back, maybe 3 hours at most. Before I walked out the door, I crouched down in front of Lily and said gently, "I'll be back before lunch, okay? You're gonna be fine. Just stick close to Grandma." Lily nodded and held onto my sleeve for just a second longer than usual. Looking back now, I wish I had read that moment differently. I wish I had stayed, but I didn't. I kissed her forehead, grabbed my bag, and left. From what I was able to reconstruct later, things started going sideways about an hour after I walked out. Margaret had asked Lily to come inside from the backyard and get cleaned up for breakfast. Simple enough request, but Lily was in the middle of something. She'd built this little arrangement of sticks and rocks near the fence, one of those quiet, focused projects she did when she was regulating herself. It was her way of staying calm. Her way of feeling in control of something small when everything else felt big. She wasn't being defiant, she just wasn't ready to stop. But Margaret didn't see it that way. According to what Lily told me weeks later, Margaret called her 3 times. And on the 3rd time, her voice had that edge in it. That cold, clipped tone that meant patience had officially run out. Lily still didn't move right away, and that was the moment my mother snapped. Margaret walked to the back door, looked out at Lily with her arms crossed, and said in a hard, flat voice, "Fine. If you want to stay outside so badly, then stay outside." And then she locked the door. She actually locked the door. Her justification, the one she gave me later with complete sincerity, was that a little isolation would help Lily calm down and think about her choices. That was the phrase she used. Think about her choices. As if a 9-year-old with sensory processing differences was throwing a calculated power move, instead of simply needing a few more minutes with her rocks and sticks. At first, Lily knocked on the door. Softly, then harder. She called out for her grandma. No answer. The sky that morning had that heavy gray look that Chicago gets in late fall, the kind that presses down on you and makes everything feel colder than it actually is. Lily wasn't wearing a jacket. She'd been outside playing. not expecting to be locked out. She sat down on the back step and pulled her knees to her chest. She waited, and she waited. And Margaret, from somewhere inside that house, waited too. Maybe she thought Lily would knock again. Maybe she thought a few minutes of discomfort would produce some kind of breakthrough. Maybe she genuinely believed she was doing something that would help. I don't know what was going through her mind. What I do know is that the minutes kept passing. 10 turned into 15. 15 crept toward 20. And at some point, Lily stopped knocking. Because here's the thing about my daughter that my mother never took the time to understand. When Lily gets scared enough, she doesn't keep asking for help. She goes somewhere else in her head. She finds her own solution, even if that solution makes no sense to anyone but her. She finds the one place that feels safe. And what she did next, where she went and why, that's the part that still keeps me up at night. What my mother didn't realize was that my daughter doesn't wait when she's scared. When I walked into the house, my mother was calm, too calm. My hearing had wrapped up earlier than expected, so I made it back just after noon. The house felt quiet in a way that should have been normal but wasn't. I set my bag down by the door and called out for Lily. No answer. I figured she was probably in her room, maybe reading or doing one of her projects. I walked into the kitchen where Margaret was standing at the counter, flipping through a magazine with a cup of tea in her hand. The scene looked completely ordinary, and that's exactly what threw me off. I leaned against the doorframe and said casually, "Hey, where's Lily? Is she upstairs?" Without looking up from her magazine, Margaret turned a page and answered in an even, unbothered voice. "She ran off somewhere. She was upset this morning, and I think she went around the block to cool down. I'm sure she'll be back soon." For just a second, I stood there processing that. Then something cold and sharp moved through me. I pushed off the doorframe and said with more urgency, "What do you mean she ran off? How long ago?" Margaret finally looked up, and with a calmness that I now recognize as rehearsed, she said, "Maybe an hour. Maybe a little more. You know how she gets, Elena. She just needed some space." The cold feeling spread from my chest straight down into my stomach. An hour. My 9-year-old daughter had been gone for over an hour, and my mother was standing in the kitchen reading a magazine. I kept my voice tight and controlled and said, "Mom, she's 9. She doesn't just run off. Did you go look for her? Did you call anyone?" Margaret set down her mug slowly and said with a slight edge of defensiveness in her voice, "I didn't want to make a scene. I thought she'd come back on her own. Children need to learn that their actions have consequences." Right then, something in me went completely still. Not calm, still. The way things go still right before something breaks. I didn't respond to that. I turned around, grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door, and walked straight back outside. I started going up and down the block, calling Lily's name. I checked the small park at the end of the street. I knocked on the door of the neighbor whose daughter Lily sometimes played with. Nothing. Nobody had seen her. I pulled out my phone and called Lily's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. By this point, my hands weren't completely steady anymore. I came back to the house and stood in the kitchen doorway again. Margaret was still at the counter, and I looked at her and said very quietly, "Something doesn't add up. Walk me through exactly what happened this morning. From the beginning." Margaret shifted slightly and started giving me this version of events that was just vague enough to avoid specifics. Lily got upset. She wouldn't listen. She needed time to think. She went outside. The details kept sliding around when I pressed on them. The timeline didn't hold together. I could feel it, that sick, creeping certainty that I wasn't getting the truth. I walked out the back door and stood in the yard for a second, trying to think, and that's when I noticed it. The house to our left, the Garcias. They'd had a security camera installed about 2 months back after a string of car break-ins on the street. It was mounted on the corner of their garage, angled toward the alley, and depending on where you were standing in our backyard, it might have caught something. My throat tightened as I pulled out my phone and called Mr. Garcia. I explained quickly that Lily was missing and asked if I could look at the footage from that morning. He didn't hesitate. He said to come right over. And then I saw the security camera footage, and everything changed. The footage showed my daughter standing outside the door for 27 minutes. Mr. Garcia pulled it up on his laptop right there at his kitchen table. He turned the screen toward me, hit play, and then quietly stepped back to give me space. I think he already had a sense of what I was about to see. The timestamp in the corner read 9:14 a.m., and there was Lily, standing at the back door of my own house, in her little gray sweatshirt, no jacket, arms wrapped around herself. She knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. She pressed her face close to the glass panel on the door and looked inside. Then she knocked again. I watched my daughter stand at that door and beg to be let back in. She wasn't throwing a fit. She wasn't acting out. She was just a scared little kid who wanted to come inside and couldn't understand why nobody was opening the door. At the 9:22 mark, she sat down on the back step. She pulled her knees up to her chest the way she always does when she's trying to hold herself together. She rocked slightly. Just slightly. That small, quiet rocking that I knew meant she was getting overwhelmed and trying to self-regulate the only way she knew how. I watched her knock 2 more times after that, each knock a little less confident than the one before it. Like hope was slowly draining out of her with every second that door stayed closed. By 9:31, she stopped knocking. She sat completely still for about a minute, and then she stood up, looked at the door one last time, and walked away toward the side gate. The footage cut off there. I don't know how long I sat in front of that screen without moving. Mr. Garcia didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Right then, my hands pressed flat on the table and my jaw locked tight, because if I let it go, I was going to fall apart completely right there in my neighbor's kitchen, and I couldn't afford to do that yet. Because Lily was still out there, but underneath the panic, something else was happening inside me. A rage so deep and so cold it didn't even feel like anger at first. It felt like the ground shifting under everything I thought I knew. Because my mother hadn't just made a bad call in a heated moment. She had locked my daughter outside in the cold, watched her knock and cry, and begged to come in, and then let her walk away. And then she had come inside, made herself a cup of tea, picked up a magazine, and waited for me to come home. And when I walked through that door asking where Lily was, she had looked me in the eye and lied. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't called me. She hadn't gone looking. She had just decided to wait and see if the problem solved itself. All those justifications she'd been carrying around about discipline and consequences and children needing to learn, she had applied every single one of them to my 9-year-old daughter who had a sensory condition and had just lost her father and had done nothing wrong except need a few more minutes outside with her rocks and sticks. I thanked Mr. Garcia, asked him to save the footage and not delete anything, and walked back across to my house. Margaret was still in the kitchen. She looked up when I came in and started to say something, but I held up my hand and said in a voice I barely recognized as my own, "Don't. Not right now." She closed her mouth, and I walked straight past her and back outside because my daughter was still missing and that was the only thing that mattered in that moment. I didn't call the police yet, because I still thought I could fix this quietly. I started running down the street, calling her name like I'd never been afraid before, and I had been afraid plenty of times in my life. I'd stood in courtrooms where the stakes were someone's entire future. I'd gotten calls in the middle of the night that changed everything. But nothing had ever felt like this, because this was Lily. This was my child. I ran to the end of the block and turned left, scanning every yard, every porch, every gap between houses. I stopped a woman walking her dog and said as steadily as I could, "I'm sorry, have you seen a little girl, 9 years old, gray sweatshirt, brown hair? She's been missing for a while." The woman shook her head with that look people get when they realize something is genuinely wrong. I was already moving before she finished her sentence. I tried Lily's phone again. 4 rings. Voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. I texted her. No response. The sky had gotten heavier since the morning, that flat gray pressing down low over the rooftops, and the temperature was dropping. I kept thinking about the footage, about her little arms wrapped around herself, about the fact that she hadn't had a jacket. Chicago in late fall doesn't negotiate with you. It doesn't care that your kid is scared or confused or barefoot. It just gets cold. I turned down the alley behind our street, checking behind dumpsters, behind fences. I felt ridiculous doing it, and I did it anyway because what else do you do when your brain starts going to the worst possible places? And my brain was absolutely going there. I've worked enough cases to know what can happen to a child alone on city streets. I've read enough police reports. I've sat across from enough families who thought their kid was just around the corner and then found out they weren't. Those images were cycling through my head on a loop, and I couldn't shut them off. I stopped at the corner of Maple and tried to think clearly for even 30 seconds. I pressed my back against the stop sign and closed my eyes and told myself to breathe. Just breathe, Elena. Think. Where would she go? Where does she go when everything feels like too much? When the world gets too loud and too heavy and she needs to find something solid to hold on to. And that's when it hit me, a memory from 2 weeks earlier. We'd been lying on the living room floor together on a Sunday afternoon, and Lily had been looking at a photo on my phone. A photo of David outside the clinic where he used to work. He'd been a physical therapist. He'd worked at that clinic for 11 years. And Lily had traced her finger over his face in the photo and said something so quietly, I almost missed it. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes still on the screen, and said in that small certain voice of hers, Dad told me that place was special. He said if I ever needed him I could find him there. I had gently explained that Dad was gone. That we couldn't find him anywhere, not really, but that we could always keep him in our hearts. She'd nodded like she understood, but I knew Lily. I knew the way her mind worked. I knew that for her, understanding something with her brain and accepting it in her body were two completely different things. She still set a place at the table for David some mornings. She still said goodnight to his photo every single night. And in her 9-year-old heart, in that quiet, unshakable logic she carried around like a compass, she had not fully let go of the idea that her dad could still show up somewhere real. Somewhere he used to be. The clinic was about 6 blocks away. I started running. My lungs burned. My dress shoes were not made for running 6 blocks on cracked Chicago sidewalks, and I didn't care even slightly. Because somewhere in my gut, I already knew. I already knew where she was. I already knew what I was going to find. I just needed to get there before something made it worse. Then I remembered something she said the night before, and my blood ran cold. She told me she missed her dad, and that she wanted to see him where he worked. The night before, after I'd tucked her in and turned off the lamp, Lily had reached out in the dark and grabbed my wrist. Not hard, just enough to stop me from leaving. I'd sat back down on the edge of her bed and waited. She did that sometimes, held on like she needed one more minute before she could let go for the night. After a long silence, she turned her face toward me and said in a voice so small, it barely filled the room. I keep dreaming about Dad at his work, the place with the blue chairs in the waiting room. I'd smoothed her hair back and said softly, I know, baby, you miss him a lot. And she'd looked at me with those steady, serious eyes of hers and said, he told me in the dream that he waits there. That's where he goes when he wants to see me. I hadn't known what to say to that, so I just held her hand until her breathing slowed and she drifted off. I hadn't thought much more about it after that. I was tired. I had an early morning. I told myself it was just a grief dream, the kind of thing kids have when they're still processing a loss that's too big for words. I told myself she was okay. I told myself a lot of things that night that I should have looked at more carefully. But now, running down those Chicago sidewalks with my lungs on fire and my heart somewhere up in my throat, that conversation was all I could hear. The clinic was on Delaney Street, tucked between a pharmacy and a dry cleaner. David had worked there for 11 years. He'd walk through those doors every morning with his travel mug and come home smelling like the antiseptic soap they kept at every station. Lily had visited him there exactly 3 times, but she remembered everything. That was one of her gifts. The things that mattered to her got pressed into her memory like flowers in a book, perfectly preserved, every detail exactly where she'd left it. She remembered the blue chairs in the waiting room. She remembered the little fish tank by the reception desk. She remembered sitting on her dad's rolling stool and spinning around while he charted his notes. And apparently she remembered the address. Because as I turned onto Delaney, and the clinic came into view at the far end of the block, I could already see a small figure on the ground near the entrance. The clinic was closed on Fridays. The lights were off inside. The parking lot was empty. And right there on the concrete outside the locked front door, sitting with her knees pulled up and her arms wrapped tight around herself, was my daughter. Everything in my chest collapsed at once. The fear, the rage, the guilt, all of it rushed up so fast. I nearly stopped running just from the weight of it. But I didn't stop. I pushed harder. My vision blurred slightly and I blinked it clear and kept my eyes fixed on her the whole way down that block because I was terrified that if I looked away for even 1 second she'd disappear. She hadn't seen me yet. She was still looking at the door, still waiting. Her lips were moving slightly, just barely. And I knew, even before I got close enough to hear, exactly what she was saying. She was talking to him. She was sitting outside a locked clinic on a cold Friday afternoon, talking to her father like he was right on the other side of that glass. Like all he had to do was unlock the door and walk out, and everything would be okay again. And when I turned the corner, I saw her. She looked at me and said, "I waited where Dad told me to." I slowed down as I got close because I didn't want to startle her. I was maybe 10 feet away when she finally heard my footsteps and looked up. Her face was pale. Her lips had that faint bluish tinge that comes from being cold for too long. Her hair was tangled and there was a dried streak on her cheek where tears had been and then stopped. She wasn't crying anymore. She was past that. She was in that quiet, glassy place she went to when she'd already used up everything she had. I dropped to my knees right there on the concrete in front of her and reached for her hands. They were ice cold. I wrapped both of mine around them and said as steadily as I could manage, "Hey, I'm here. I've got you. You're okay." She looked at me for a long moment with those serious eyes, and then she said it, in the most matter-of-fact voice, like she was reporting something she'd carefully observed and confirmed. "I waited where Dad told me to. In the dream he said this is where he comes when he wants to see me. So I came here and I waited. But the door is locked." Right then, my chest didn't just tighten. It caved in. Because she wasn't confused about reality the way people might assume. She knew her dad was gone. She knew in the logical, concrete part of her mind that he wasn't going to walk through that door. But grief in a 9-year-old doesn't follow logic. It follows feeling. And every feeling she had was telling her that if she could just get to the right place and wait long enough, some version of him would find her. And instead of being somewhere safe when that feeling took over, she had been locked outside by the one adult who was supposed to be watching her, left to find her own way through a city she was 9 years old in, guided by a dream and the memory of blue chairs in a waiting room. I pulled her into my arms and held on. She didn't resist. She just leaned in and pressed her face against my shoulder and stayed very still, the way she did when she was completely spent. I could feel her shaking, not dramatically, just that low, constant tremor that runs through a small body that's been cold and scared and alone for too long. I held her tighter and pressed my face into her hair, and for a moment I couldn't speak at all, because if I opened my mouth, I was going to come apart completely. And she needed me solid right now. She needed me present, so I held it together. Barely, but I held it. After a minute, I pulled back just enough to look at her face, and I said carefully, "How long have you been here, baby?" She thought about it, with that deliberate way she had, like she was checking an internal clock, and then she said, "A long time. The sun was higher before." I looked down at her feet. She was wearing socks but no shoes. Her socks were damp from the ground. I took off my jacket without thinking and wrapped it around her shoulders, then I scooped her up off the ground entirely and held her against me and started walking. She was too big to carry comfortably, and I didn't care even slightly. I called 911 as I walked, told them I had a child who'd been exposed to cold for an extended period and needed to be checked out. I gave them our location. I kept my voice level and clear the way I'd trained myself to do under pressure, and then I hung up and just held my daughter and walked. She'd stopped shaking quite as hard by the time the paramedics arrived. They checked her over right there on the sidewalk. Temperature, responsiveness, circulation. Mild hypothermia, they said. Catch it early enough and kids bounce back faster than you'd expect. They wanted to take her in for observation, just to be safe, and I agreed immediately. I rode with her in the back of the ambulance with her hand in both of mine the whole way. She fell asleep about 3 minutes into the ride. Just completely dropped off, like her body had finally decided it was safe enough to let go. I watched her sleep, and I thought about my mother standing in that kitchen with her magazine and her tea. I thought about 27 minutes of footage. I thought about a locked door, and a child knocking, and nobody answering. And somewhere, between the anger and the grief and the guilt and the bone-deep exhaustion of that entire impossible day, something inside me made a decision. Not the lawyer part of me. Not the rational, strategy-minded part that weighs options and considers outcomes. Something much older and much simpler than that, the part of me that was just her mother. That night, I made a decision that would destroy my family forever. 3 months after that day, I stood in court, facing my own mother. I want you to think about what that actually means for a second. I'm a public defender. I've spent my entire career in courtrooms. I know exactly what it costs a family when the legal system gets involved. I know the collateral damage. I know that once you walk through that door, nothing ever goes back to the way it was. I knew all of that, and I filed the charges anyway. The night Lily came home from the hospital, I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, and I thought through every single option available to me. I could confront my mother privately. I could demand an apology and set strict boundaries and try to handle it as a family matter. I could tell myself it was a terrible mistake made by a woman from a different generation who genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. I cycled through every version of that story. And every time I got to the part where Lily was sitting alone on that cold concrete outside a locked clinic, talking to her dead father because she had nowhere else to go, every single justification collapsed. Because I had the footage, 27 minutes, time-stamped, undeniable. And I had a daughter who came home with mild hypothermia and damp socks and a look in her eyes that I'd never seen before and hoped to never see again, so I made the call. I filed a report with Child Protective Services, and based on the footage and the medical documentation, the DA's office picked it up from there. The day Margaret walked into that courtroom, she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. She was dressed carefully, the way she always dressed when appearances mattered to her, which was always, but underneath that composure, I could see something cracking. She looked at me from across that room, and for just a moment her face did something I wasn't prepared for. It broke. Not in anger, in genuine shock. Like some part of her had never truly believed I would actually do this. Like she'd been waiting for me to come to my senses and make it all go away. And standing there watching her face fall apart, a wave of grief hit me so hard I had to look down at my notes just to stay steady. Because I wasn't doing this because I hated her. I was doing this because I loved my daughter more than I needed my mother's approval. Those are two completely different things, and it took me 38 years and one locked door to finally understand that. The case didn't end the way either of us expected. Margaret's attorney negotiated. Given her age, her clean record, and the fact that Lily had recovered physically, the DA agreed to a plea arrangement. No jail time. Mandatory parenting education classes, which felt almost absurd for a 65-year-old woman, and a formal restraining order keeping her away from Lily for 2 years. Margaret wept in the hallway afterward. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder. I walked past without stopping. Not because I felt nothing, because I felt everything, and I couldn't afford to fall apart on those courthouse steps. I had a daughter waiting for me at home. But even after the case ended, the real question stayed with me. 6 months have passed since that day, and my life has never been the same. Not in the way people usually mean when they say that. Not like everything fell apart and stayed broken. More like the version of my life I'd been holding on to, the one where family meant safe by default, where blood meant loyalty without condition, where keeping the peace was the same thing as doing the right thing. That version is just gone now. And honestly, I'm still figuring out how I feel about that. Lily is in therapy twice a week with a specialist who actually understands sensory processing. She talks about her dad in session. She draws pictures of him. She's learning, slowly and in her own time, how to carry his memory without it pulling her somewhere dangerous. She still says goodnight to his photo every night. I've stopped trying to change that. Some things don't need to be fixed. They just need to be honored. She hasn't asked about her grandma once, not once in 6 months. I don't know if that breaks my heart or tells me everything I need to know. Maybe both. As for Margaret, I haven't spoken to her since the courthouse hallway. The restraining order made that easier in a logistical sense. But restraining orders don't reach into your 3 a.m. thoughts. They don't stop you from picking up your phone and staring at her contact name and putting it back down again. I've done that more times than I'd like to admit. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about cutting off a parent. It doesn't feel like freedom, at least not right away. It feels like an amputation. Necessary maybe, but still a loss. Still something missing where something used to be. I grew up believing that family was the one thing you didn't walk away from no matter what. My mother taught me that actually. And now I've had to dismantle the lesson using tools she never gave me. I've had to learn, at 38 years old, that love without safety isn't love, it's just habit. That protecting your child isn't optional, even when the threat is wearing your mother's face. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappoint someone who was supposed to be on your side. I'm not at peace with all of it yet. I want to be honest about that. There are days when I wonder if I could have handled it differently. If there was some version of events where Lily was still safe and my mother and I still had something left. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure I ever will. What I do know is that my daughter is sleeping in her own bed every night now. She's learning that the world can be loud and overwhelming and still survivable. She's laughing more than she was 6 months ago. Small laughs, real ones. And every single time I hear that sound, I know I made the right call. So I want to ask you something before I go. And I want you to actually think about it, not just the easy answer, the real one. If you were in my position, knowing everything you now know, would you have done the same thing? Would you have stood up in that courtroom and faced your own mother? Or would you have found a way to forgive her and kept your family intact? Because I don't think there's one right answer. I think it depends on what you're willing to live with. And what you're not. Tell me what you think. I really want to know.